This is not going to say you should never get close to tornadoes, you should never chase at night, etc. I'd be a hypocrite if I were saying those things. I really enjoy getting up close and personal to supercells and tornadoes. So this is going to give you suggestions on how to do those types of things safely and effectively, based on my years of chasing and experience. But again, these are going to be suggestions. Every storm is different, every situation is different, some of which may not be explicitly outlined in this module. You are responsible for your actions and decisions out in the field. Storm Chaser Coaching is not responsible for your actions, including your navigational decisions when you're out in the field storm chasing. The goal is always to be as safe as possible. So in some situations, these suggestions I'm going to give you may not be the most optimal thing to do. A lot of it is based on your comfort and skill level. If you're not super well versed in severe storm behavior and meteorology, or if you're just a new chaser overall, it's probably not a great idea to get super close to tornadoes right off the bat. You may want to stay back for a little while until you have a better grasp on severe storm behaviors and such. And if you find yourself in a dicey situation on a storm, it's okay to back off. One storm is not worth your life. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started.
The Chaser Academy is the best deal in storm chasing. Click the join button below this video and find out why.
Let's start off with low precipitation supercells. For all of these examples coming up, I've drawn in the updraft as this pink dashed circle, and we're going to assume that storm motion is due westerly, so from west to east. LP supercells are perhaps the easiest type of supercell to chase because there's excellent visibility on pretty much every side of the storm, and there's very little precipitation to shroud the updraft in any of its features. Positioning yourself directly underneath the updraft base of an LP supercell is usually quite safe. As we mentioned in episode 2 of this module, tornado production in low precipitation supercells is much more rare than in classic and high precipitation supercells. So you don't have a ton to worry about as far as severe thunderstorm hazards underneath the updraft base of an LP supercell. If you're a newer chaser who eventually wants to start getting closer to supercells and tornadoes, practicing with an LP supercell is often a good idea. That being said, being underneath the updraft base of an LP supercell may make you miss what LP supercells really have to offer, and that is the barber pole or corkscrew type structure. Therefore, positioning yourself slightly farther back and somewhere to the east, south, or west of the updraft is optimal for capturing the barber pole type structure. The main hazard to be aware of with LP supercells is large hail. Large hail, of course, may fall within the precipitation core of the storm, even if the precipitation core is not all that visually evident. As we know, LP supercells don't produce a lot of precipitation by nature, so it may be difficult to ascertain whether or not a precipitation core actually exists, but large hail may still be falling. And on radar, you can tell where that precipitation core is by looking for the highest reflectivity region within the supercell's presentation on reflectivity. Some of the largest hail within an LP supercell can fall in a region called the vault. The vault is located on the side of the updraft just into the inflow region of the storm between the core of the updraft and the precipitation core of the supercell. Visually, the vault is this tall, ragged side of the updraft and the generally low precipitation region adjacent to it. The vault is synonymous with the bounded weak echo region, or beware. We talked about the beware in depth in episode 2 of the Radar Foundations module, but as a refresher, the bounded weak echo region is a region of weak reflectivity surrounded by higher reflectivity in the mid-levels of a storm. It's an indication of a very strong updraft, one that's efficiently lofting precipitation particles, including large hail, to higher and higher levels of the storm and prohibiting precipitation fallout in that region. The bounded weak echo region is topped by a phenomenon called the echo overhang. The echo overhang is simply where the updraft lofts precipitation particles, including large hail, out into the downdraft. However, on occasion, very large hailstones can fall out of the echo overhang into the vault region of the storm. These will be very sporadic in nature, and you may not have any visual clue that hail is falling there, but they can be some of the largest hailstones found in an LP supercell. Therefore, if you decide to set up on the east side of the updraft, which is often an optimal position to chase an LP supercell from because you can see pretty much the entire structure of the storm, including the vault region. Always be aware of the potential for rapidly changing storm motion, given the close proximity of the precipitation core and vault region. Speaking of those, always have a good idea of where the vault region and the precipitation core of the storm are relative to your position so that you can avoid hail. Now, this is somewhat up to your hail tolerance, so to speak. If you're okay getting a few dings in your car or getting a few cracks in your windshield, then you can play a little bit closer to the forward flank or the precipitation core of the storm. If not, you may want to stay a little bit farther back. Always remember that in most LP supercell cases, the hail is going to be quite sporadic, but it can be quite large as well, and can certainly do some damage. If you find yourself to the north of an LP supercell, or in the precipitation core of the storm, the best course of action to reposition is usually to drive west, then south, then east in front of the updraft. This is a good option with LP supercells because, again, LP supercells provide excellent visibility from the west. This is going to be a safe maneuver in most supercell cases in general, not just with LP supercells, although you may lose visibility of storm features from the west in classic and especially HP supercells. But it's going to keep you out of the path of any potential tornadic activity, which makes it a safe maneuver. LP supercells also provide perhaps one of the only opportunities in storm chasing where cutting from north to south in front of the mesocyclone of a storm is a viable option. This is because, number one, the cores of LP supercells tend to be fairly small in spatial extent. Number two, they tend to be fairly translucent as well, so you can maintain visual contact with the updraft and its important features while interacting with or passing by the core. And number three, the fact that LP supercells tend to be much less likely to produce tornadoes. Still, you need to keep a very close eye on radar data and any changes in the storm structure or in the updraft base that may suggest that tornado genesis is imminent. While tornadoes are rare in LP supercells, they still can happen. And this maneuver may put you somewhat close to the vault region of the storm, which again houses very large hail in some cases. We're going to discuss why this is a much more dangerous maneuver for classic and especially HP supercells in just a bit. Alright, let's move on to classic supercells. Classic supercells are pretty much the crown jewel of storm chasing. They often offer the best of both worlds. Great structure, and they can produce tornadoes that are quite visible and chaseable. But that involves extra pieces to the puzzle and extra safety measures you must employ in order to effectively navigate around them. Along with safety considerations, where you decide to position yourself around a classic supercell has a lot to do with what kind of lighting and contrast you're looking for. This is important for viewing in general, but especially if you're interested in getting good storm photos. From a position east of the mesocyclone, the sun will be behind the storm, and therefore, storm features such as wall clouds and tornadoes will be backlit. They'll tend to be darker and more silhouetted. In contrast, from the west, storm features will be frontlit. Colors will tend to be a bit flatter, and storm features will tend to be more white in nature. Again, remember that for these examples, storm motion is from west to east. We'll talk about how things change when storm motion, and therefore storm orientation, changes in just a bit. A general rule of thumb is that when the sun is at an offset angle to your direction of viewing, contrast will be slightly less harsh compared to when the sun is directly behind the storm from your view. Positioning yourself to the east of a classic supercell's mesocyclone is often an optimal position for viewing. You'll have an excellent view of the supercell structure, especially if you decide to position outside of the updraft base of the supercell, and the important features such as wall clouds and tornadoes will be nicely backlit. Sometimes from the east, the contrast might be slightly too harsh, with the area behind the wall cloud or tornado quite bright, making it difficult to photograph. Therefore, using our rule of thumb that we just discussed, situating yourself just southeast of the mesocyclone's motion might be the most optimal, as it slightly lessens the harshness of the contrast but still provides you a full view of the storm structure and important features. Setting up anywhere south of the mesocyclone's motion is going to be a fairly safe spot to be in. You're not going to have to worry about any consequences of being directly in the path of tornadic circulations, and you'll be fairly well removed from other supercell hazards. So if you're a lesser experienced or newer chaser, this is a great spot to start with. Now, of note, the farther south you go relative to the mesocyclone of the storm, the contrast tends to get a bit worse. But nonetheless, this is a very safe spot to be in, especially if you are a less experienced chaser. Regardless of whether you set up east, southeast, or south of the mesocyclone of the supercell, you must be aware of sudden changes in storm motion, just like we talked about with LP supercells. For example, let's say you set up east of the mesocyclone and the storm decides to take a jog to the south. Well, large hail is lurking in the precipitation core, often on the very edges of the forward flank as well, so you can be easily impacted by large hail should this occur. Also, for folks who set up southeast or south of the mesocyclone, there have been many cases in the past where tornadoes have deviated to the south, putting folks in these regions in danger. This is quite rare, and being southeast or south of the mesocyclone of the storm is, again, quite a safe position to be in, but it still needs to be taken into consideration. Now, unlike LP supercells, being to the west of the updraft and the mesocyclone of a classic supercell is not the best position to be in. This is because precipitation from the rear flank downdraft, which wraps around the low-level mesocyclone, can obscure important storm features such as wall clouds and tornadic circulations. Also, impressive storm structure, such as striations in the updraft, are only going to be visible from the east, southeast, or south of the updraft. Precipitation may obscure those features from the west as well. However, being to the west of the updraft is often a good position to witness the rope-out or occlusion process of tornado dissipation. This is when the rear flank downdraft wraps completely around the tornadic circulation, choking it off from the warm, moist inflow. As this happens, the decaying tornadic circulation tends to move to the rear of the storm, making a position to the west of the updraft a great spot to watch tornado dissipation and rope out. Now, for those of you who want to get close to tornadoes, the best place to do that within a classic supercell is from the inflow notch north and northeast of the circulation to just east of the mesocyclone. This is called the bear's cage. Now, typically the bear's cage only refers to the inflow notch portion, but for our purposes we'll include that area just ahead of the mesocyclone as well, as the safety precautions you must take in all of these locations are very similar. Now, there are some absolute non-negotiables when you're in the bear's cage. You need a comprehensive knowledge of storm features, storm behavior, and the environment. If you can't tell the difference between a wall cloud and a shelf cloud, or if you don't know the signs visually of a storm that is about to produce a tornado, then the bear's cage is not for you. And similarly, you need to have a good idea of the environment ahead of time. And we're going to talk about this in depth when we talk about deviant tornado motion here in just a bit. But is it an environment that might favor erratic tornado motions? Is it an environment that would favor strong to violent tornadoes that might expand quite quickly? These are the questions you need to be able to answer ahead of time so that, number one, you know if it's even a good idea to enter the bear's cage, and number two, you can act appropriately when you're in the bear's cage based on how the situation is unfolding. You need to have multiple reliable escape routes to get out of harm's way in case the need arises. You need to plan these out ahead of time. The last thing you need is to be in a dicey situation in the bear's cage and not have a plan to get out of the way. Or you try to get out of the way, take some random back road, and you get stuck, or it suddenly dead ends. Then you're going to be in a real bad situation. You need to make sure these escape routes are reliable. That goes with planning them out ahead of time. And maybe, say, if you're not comfortable driving on dirt roads, then maybe don't use a dirt road as an escape route. And if those are your only options, you might want to think twice about being in the bear's cage. Typically, a good escape route in this situation is off to the east, parallel with the tornado's path. This allows you to get out of the way without crossing the path of the tornado. This is a scenario where it's especially important to have a reliable escape route. Let's say you're in the bear's cage in the inflow notch, and you only have one dirt road off to the east. That might be of questionable quality, one that you can only go maybe 30 to 40 miles an hour on. And let's say the storm's moving at 30 to 40 miles an hour. Well, in that case, you're not going to be able to get out ahead of the tornado, and that's not going to be a viable escape route. When you're in the inflow notch, in the bear's cage, and you're anywhere north of the tornado's path, you never want to cut south in front of it. Anytime you cross the path of a tornado, you're putting yourself in extreme danger, especially at this close of a proximity. The only time you should ever cut south in front of a tornado's path from the north is when you give the circulation ample space. That means often going well out to the east, perhaps even several miles, and then cutting south in front of the circulation. This is another reason why the bear's cage is a dangerous position to be in, because it completely cuts off your escape routes to the south. Now, if you put yourself immediately east of the tornado's path, going south is a viable escape option because you're not actually crossing the path of the circulation. But anytime you are north of the circulation, cutting south in front of it is a bad idea. Now, always remember that a viable escape option may be to the north into the storm's core. Yes, this puts you directly into the core and may subject you to very large hail, but some hail damage to your car is a lot better than getting stuck in the path of a significant tornado. So in the absence of any good escape options to the east, going north can be a viable option if necessary. Another non-negotiable in the bear's cage is unimpeded use of your chasing tools. What do I mean by this? Well, you need to maintain good visibility. Your eyes are the most important tool when you're in the bear's cage, and if you start to lose visibility through things like precipitation or dust or even terrain, then being in the bear's cage is not a good idea. You need good cell service so that you have unimpeded access to things like radar, your navigational tools like Google Maps, etc. You need these tools at all times to be able to assess the storm's behavior, plan out your escape routes, etc. You never want to play a guessing game in the bear's cage, so if you lose service, that's going to be a cue to perhaps reposition outside of the bear's cage. So to summarize, you always want to maintain good visibility, good service, etc. When you're in the bear's cage, you need it to be kind of a perfect situation. Otherwise, being in the bear's cage is a bad idea. The easiest and safest way to access the bear's cage is to wait somewhere downstream and let it come to you. With the classic Supercell, you're often going to have very good visibility back into the inflow notch region of the storm. Therefore, you'll have more time to make a plan of action as far as how to navigate once the bear's cage approaches. This kind of goes hand in hand with one of the deciding factors of whether or not you'd want to get into the bear's cage, and that's the road network. Let's say there's maybe only one road to keep up with this storm, and maybe it doesn't keep us directly in the path of the storm. Do we want to get up into the bear's cage, get close, and then kind of be done with it? Or do we want to stay farther back, sacrifice more of the close range view for a longer amount of time with the storm, and then maybe getting closer as opportunities present themselves down the line? So the road network is a factor you must take into consideration when deciding whether or not you actually want to be in the bear's cage and whether or not being in the bear's cage is viable. Now, if you find yourself on the backside of the storm and maybe there's no feasible way to go south then east to get in front of the storm, there is a way to get into the bear's cage and close to any tornadic circulations, and it's called the hook slice maneuver. A hook slice is when you cut directly through the hook echo from the backside into the bear's cage. There will often be a low precipitation or precipitation-free region between the edge of the hook echo and the low-level mesocyclone, meaning that hook slicing can give you an excellent close-range view of any tornadoes. However, hook slicing is an extremely dangerous maneuver, so if you're a newer or less experienced chaser, I strongly recommend that you do not perform hook slice maneuvers until you're well versed in supercell features and behaviors, and until you've gone with someone multiple times who can show you the ropes of how to perform these maneuvers effectively and safely. Hook slicing should really only be done on classic supercells with highly visible features, wall clouds, tornadoes, etc. It's possible that as you penetrate through the hook echo, visibility may decrease a bit, but ideally you'd have some semblance of visibility of the area of interest throughout the entire process. You must also maintain cell service when you're performing a hook slice. Oftentimes, as you're penetrating through the hook, visibility may decrease some, and you'll have to rely a lot on radar to know your position relative to that of the low-level mesocyclone or tornado. Hook slicing is easiest and safest to do when you drive through the hook echo at an angle that's parallel to the tornado's path. This minimizes the chance that you actually get into the path of the tornado. Never, ever perform a hook slice maneuver if the only goal of that hook slice is to beat the tornado before it crosses the road. For example, let's say our tornado is moving from southwest to northeast, and our only road option in this area is a road that goes from west to east. Hook slicing to get into the notch, allow the tornado to pass, and then continue on is okay. But if your only goal is to cross the path of the tornado to get in front of it once again, that's a bad idea. Let the tornado cross the road and then reposition as needed. Once again, crossing the path of the tornado at this close of a range is extremely dangerous and should be avoided. Keep a very close eye on wind direction as you punch through the hook. Winds tend to flow toward the center of low pressure of a tornadic circulation, so as you're passing through the hook and into the clearer air of the inflow notch, if you're experiencing northwesterly winds, then you're in a relatively safe position as the tornado is likely off to your southeast. If you're experiencing northerly or northeasterly winds, then you may be in danger as the tornado is off to your south or southwest, and you may very well be in its path. I can't reiterate enough how dangerous of a move hook slicing can be, and how experienced you need to be to perform a hook slice. And even though hook slicing can give you an excellent close-up view of tornadoes, there are still many disadvantages to this move. For one, it even further limits your escape routes. If something gets dicey, really all you have is back west into the hook or north into the precipitation core of the storm, both of which can expose you to heavy rain and hail. It effectively takes away your east option because, again, you're cutting in front of the path of the tornado, which is never a good idea at that close of a range. Oftentimes, it gives you maybe only a couple minutes to view the tornado before the precipitation from the hook overtakes you again, as the tornado moves away. Hook slicing is certainly not compatible with getting out of your car, setting up your tripods, etc. There can also be very large hail within the rear flank downdraft that comprises the hook. In fact, some of the biggest hailstones within a supercell can reside within the rear flank downdraft. These hailstones are often wind-driven and can take out your car's windows. Strong inflow winds that flow into the tornado can also take out your windows as they loft dirt and debris. If you're ever performing a hook slice maneuver and you get uncomfortable with the situation or you lose visibility or cell service, abort the hook slice immediately. Let the tornado pass and then reposition as needed. Here's an example of a hook slice maneuver that I performed during a chase in northwest Texas on April 27, 2024. We were chasing this supercell. We were just south of the hook echo at this time, and we'd been right underneath the hook. The storm was moving to the northeast, and we didn't see anything imminently tornadic, but we knew, given the environment, that tornadogenesis may occur soon with this supercell. So instead of going all the way back south and then back northeast to get in front of it, which would put us in jeopardy of falling behind on this storm, we decided to go north and then east on Highway 82 by performing a hook slice maneuver. This was what the radar looked like just a few minutes later. We had gone north on the Farm to Market Road and then turned east on Highway 82, right into the bear's cage as tornadogenesis occurred. Here is footage from my dash cam as we were punching through the hook on Highway 82, driving from west to east. And you can see that we're getting impacted by a lot of rain and hail, but we still had a good visual of the entire storm base out there on the horizon. Shortly thereafter, we pulled into the low reflectivity region between the edge of the hook and the mesocyclone, and our visibility was perfect. This was something that made us feel comfortable about doing this hook slice maneuver. We had such great visibility. We continued to inch off to the east, and it gave us an excellent view of tornadogenesis that occurred right in front of our eyes. Given that the tornado was moving from southwest to northeast and going to cross the road in front of us, we decided to stop for a minute, let that happen before we continued off to the east. And in the matter of a minute or so, the precipitation filled right back in. So you can see how fleeting these views can be that hook slicing provides. But this was overall a good example of a situation where hook slicing was a viable option for us. It gave us the best view of the tornado instead of going all the way around back to the south and then east that might have allowed us to fall behind the storm. We got a nice up-close view of the tornado, and we did it safely because we had such great visibility. If you're stuck anywhere north of the supercell, heading east and then south is a viable way to reposition. Remember, you want to give yourself as much space as you can before cutting south in front of the storm's path, especially if it's tornadic. This will also help you avoid most of the precipitation core, which can contain large hail. Now, there is a way to get into the inflow notch or bear's cage of the storm from the north, and that is the core punch. The core punch is when you drive directly through the precipitation core into the inflow notch of the storm, typically from north to south. This is akin to the hook slice maneuver, only we're driving through the precipitation core instead of the hook. The core punch is perhaps more dangerous than the hook slice maneuver because you will lose visibility in the core of a supercell. Unlike a hook slice where you may maintain some semblance of visibility throughout the entire process, the precipitation in the core of a supercell is often way too thick to see through, so you won't be able to visually monitor the important features of the storm. You'll have to rely on radar alone, and you won't regain visibility until you start to pull into the inflow notch. You'll also have to contend with a longer duration of heavy rain and large to even very large hail. So if you're a newer or inexperienced chaser, this is another maneuver that you should not employ. Also, if you're uncomfortable with hail damage to your vehicle, you should not core punch either. Many of the same safety precautions that hook slicing requires are applicable to core punching. Always keep your head on a swivel, and always make sure you maintain cell service throughout the entire process. Again, you're relying heavily on radar because of the lack of visibility, so if you lose cell service, abort the core punch immediately. Always plan your escape routes and your next moves ahead of time. The last thing you want to do is pop into the inflow notch, there's a tornado in progress, and you haven't planned out your next move. You'll be pulling into the inflow notch in pretty close proximity to any potential tornadic circulations, so you need to have your escape routes planned well ahead of time, even before you start punching the core. And also, plan for more time than you think you'll need to complete the core punch maneuver because you'll be driving in very hostile conditions. Heavy rain, large hail, visibility may decrease, and you probably won't be able to go as fast as you would in dry conditions when you're punching the core. Let's now move on to high precipitation supercells. These are the most dangerous type of supercell to chase because, as we discussed in the previous episode, much of the updraft and its important features, such as wall clouds and tornadic activity, is shrouded in precipitation. The main payoff from a chasing perspective is usually the beastly structure that HP supercells are known for. HP supercells should be treated with even more respect than other types of supercells. The most fruitful and safest viewing spot is well out to the east and maybe east-southeast of the updraft. This gives you a great view back toward the updraft of the storm structure. Views from the south and west are suboptimal, as heavy precipitation will shroud any type of notable or photogenic feature. Really, the only place you'll be able to see a tornado in an HP supercell is from the bear's cage, and even then, it might not be possible because of all the precipitation wrapping around the circulation. Sometimes you literally have to be right up on the tornado to have any chance of seeing it. The bear's cage of an HP supercell is perhaps one of the most, if not the most dangerous places to be in any kind of supercell. This is because visibility is extremely limited. Unlike a classic supercell where the bear's cage will provide some semblance of visibility at the very least of the important features and any tornadic circulations, that's usually not the case in HP supercells. This is very problematic, as we've discussed, because you're unable to monitor the important features of the storm, which makes being in the bear's cage of an HP supercell extremely, extremely dangerous. And there really aren't many advantages to being inside the bear's cage of an HP supercell. If you do get a fleeting glimpse of a tornado, it's often amorphous. It might look like a gray mass with very little definition. Not really much to photograph or film. Of course, you'll also be socked in with precipitation, so you can't really get out, watch, and enjoy the situation. It's a very high-stress place to be as well. Overall, I don't really recommend it for anybody, let alone newer or inexperienced chasers. I've been chasing for almost a decade and a half now, and trying to get up close to tornadoes in HP supercells really doesn't interest me all that much for the reasons we've stated. If you do choose to be in the bear's cage of an HP supercell, or if you happen to find yourself in there, you need to have your head on an absolute swivel. You need to have constant awareness of what's going on in all 360 degrees around and above you. Keep a very close eye on the winds. As we discussed with hook slicing in classic supercells, the same concepts apply here. You also need to put extra effort into finding good, reliable escape routes. That is a non-negotiable when chasing in the bear's cage of an HP supercell. And you need to maintain cell service. Because visibility is going to be severely compromised, you're going to be relying on radar a lot. So if you don't have cell service to be able to monitor the radar frequently, then you should not be in the bear's cage.
The Chaser Academy is the best deal in storm chasing, and it costs less than a combo meal at McDonald's. Unlock instant access to exclusive storm chasing presentations, participate in live group coaching sessions, and get answers to all of your questions in the unlimited Q&A chat. Whether you're a beginner, a veteran, or somewhere in between, our expert coaches will help you take your storm chasing experience to the next level. Click the join button below this video or on our profile page and enroll in the Chaser Academy right now.
So that should give you a good idea of how to approach navigating around the different types of supercells. However, there are some factors that can complicate things. First, the supercell's orientation and direction of motion can cause things to be a bit different from what we talked about earlier. These are both modulated by the winds aloft. For example, in an environment like this, most of the winds aloft are out of the northwest. Much of that mid and upper level hodograph is in the bottom right quadrant. And that does a couple of things. Number one, it allows the storm motion to be much more toward the southeast, and it can change the orientation of the supercell. The hook echo might be on the west or northwest side of the storm compared to our example earlier in which it was on the southwest flank of the storm. And the precipitation will be vented off to the east or southeast of the hook echo. This is a classic supercell, and before we talked about how being out to the east of a classic supercell is best. It gives you the best look into the mesocyclone region of the storm. Well, now with a storm motion to the southeast and the precipitation vented as such, being out to the southeast of the updraft and mesocyclone would be your best bet. Being off to the east of the mesocyclone would put you right in the bear's cage, and maneuvers like hook slicing, which before was from west to east through the hook, now would be from northwest to southeast through the hook. So always be aware of the winds aloft and what that does to your supercell orientation and direction of motion, and adapt as such from the examples we talked about earlier. The forward speed of the storm can be another complicating factor. Faster moving storms, 40, 50, 60 plus miles an hour, give you a much lower margin for error. So in those cases, you may want to pick a spot downstream and wait for the storm to come to you. Versus with a slower moving storm, it's much easier to make adjustments around the storm as far as your positioning goes, and you can get closer to the storm without risking falling behind. Auxiliary cells around your supercell can also complicate things. Supercells need a perfect balance of inflow and outflow to become tornadic. If the storm is experiencing strong storm relative inflow, there needs to be a lot of outflow to balance that out. Where does this outflow come from? Auxiliary storms on the rear flank of the supercell. We can diagnose the degree of storm relative inflow from the hodograph, whether that's in forecast hodographs leading up to the event or in observed soundings in proximity to your supercell during the event. We talked about storm relative inflow in our last episode of this module when we discussed mini supercells. As a refresher, the storm relative inflow vector is drawn from the storm motion to the low levels of the hodograph. For this technique, we'll use the surface point on the hodograph. In this example, we have over 50 knots of storm relative inflow. That is a ton of storm relative inflow. That means that supercells in this environment are going to need a lot of auxiliary cells to provide outflow to balance out the strong storm relative inflow. On the other hand, supercells in environments with weak storm relative inflow like this one, here it's about 25 knots, don't need as many auxiliary cells to achieve that inflow-outflow balance. So what does this have to do with navigation? Well, it can make navigating around the rear flank of a storm somewhat difficult. Whether you're diverting around a storm, driving south, then east in front of a storm, or you're performing a hook slice maneuver. These auxiliary cells can make driving conditions very difficult. It can clutter the hook with more precipitation than normal, allowing visibility to decrease drastically, and therefore turning the hook slice maneuver into a very dangerous one. And overall, it can perhaps turn a classic supercell into a little bit more of a grungier one, maybe not fully high precipitation, but it can introduce some extra precipitation into the rear flank of the storm, making things a little bit grungier from a visibility perspective. So always be aware of auxiliary cells on the rear flank of a supercell, and adjust your strategy accordingly. Always be aware of secondary circulations, especially if you're navigating close to a mesocyclone or tornado. Always keep your head on a swivel and watch out for satellite tornadoes. And on occasion, spin-up tornadoes can occur on the rear flank downdraft gust front. This boundary will emanate from the mesocyclone of the storm down to the south or southwest in a typical eastward moving supercell. Oftentimes, these circulations will be anticyclonic in nature and often somewhat brief, but extreme caution should be taken, especially if you're just south or southeast of the mesocyclone of a storm. And finally, always be aware of if a tornado is starting to occlude and dissipate. This is especially important if you're anywhere north of the circulation. Occlusion occurs when the rear flank downdraft wraps completely around the tornado, cutting it off from the warm, moist inflow that feeds it. As this happens, the tornado can make a sharp turn to the left or north. This can put anybody to the north of the circulation in a very compromised position should this happen. The good news is that you can actually forecast deviant tornado motion ahead of time using a hodograph. This can and should be done ahead of time when you're forecasting for a storm chase using forecast soundings, or you can use observed soundings in proximity to your target area out in the field. This is a simple technique that was devised by Nixon and Allen 2021, and we start off by finding the mean wind in the lowest 500 meters of the atmosphere. Now, there's not a 500 meter point that's explicitly labeled on the hodograph, but a nice little tip to know is that this purple line right here, that is the 0 to 500 meter wind shear vector. So the endpoint of this line is your 500 meter point. And this is going to be displayed on all soundings that you'll see from the Storm Prediction Center, whether it's observed soundings, or for modeled soundings on your favorite model sites like College of DuPage and Pivotal Weather, as long as the effective inflow layer base is at the surface. Basically, if this bottom blue line here extends from the surface point on the hodograph. If it's not plotted, you'll just have to estimate the location of the 500 meter point on the hodograph. So we want to find the mean or average wind in that lowest 500 meters of the hodograph. Just eyeballing it, it looks like it'll be somewhere kind of right in here. It doesn't have to be perfect, and it's not going to be right on the line because we have a little bit of curvature there in the low levels of that hodograph. But for our purposes here, eyeballing it is going to be okay. So there's our first point. Then we find the storm motion vector, that bunker's right storm motion, which is right there. We then find the midpoint between these 2 points, which looks to be about right in there. We then draw a vector from our origin to that point, and that is our deviant tornado motion vector. We compare that to our storm motion vector. I'll draw it in blue here. And the larger the difference is between the deviant tornado motion vector and our storm motion vector, the more deviant tornadoes are likely to be. And this is pretty significant deviance here. You see quite a decent angle between those two vectors. So that shows that tornadoes will tend to be quite deviant when they're occluding, and they'll tend to deviate pretty hard to the left of the storm motion. How about another example? So here is our 500 meter point right there. Let's find the mean wind in the lowest 500 meters. Kind of in the center of this triangle it would be, so kind of right in there. We then find the storm motion, which is there, and then find the midpoint between the two. Looks to be right in there. I'll draw in our deviant tornado motion vector. Looks like that. And then compare it to our storm motion vector. And you see a much lesser angle between these two vectors than in our last example, which means that tornadoes may not tend to be as deviant in this environment. Slow-moving storms tend to produce much more deviant tornadoes than fast-moving storms. Regardless, you should always use extreme caution when north of a tornadic circulation. Always have your escape routes handy, have your head on a swivel, and maintain situational awareness at all times. Finally, I wanted to briefly discuss when you should pounce on a storm quickly versus when you should give it some time to organize. The situations in which you should get onto a storm immediately are, number one, when the storm is anchored to an outflow boundary. Outflow boundaries can be breeding grounds for tornadic supercells. Along the outflow boundary, there is enhanced low-level shear and vorticity or spin. Updrafts that go up along the boundary can tilt and stretch that vorticity into the vertical to create landspout tornadoes, even before the storm becomes mature. And storms that anchor to the boundary, which means that they track along or latch onto the boundary, they operate in that higher low-level shear environment, which means that those storms can have a much higher chance of producing tornadoes than storms that are not anchored to the boundary. Also, when you have an overlap of strong low-level instability, which is measured by 0 to 3 kilometer CAPE or 3 CAPE, and surface vorticity or spin, that's another situation in which you want to pounce on the storm quickly. Strong low-level instability can tilt and stretch that spin or vorticity at the surface into the vertical underneath updrafts, which can aid in tornadogenesis in supercells. This process can happen fairly quickly, so when you see those two ingredients overlapping and storms going up in that overlap, you want to get on the storm immediately. In most other scenarios, storms need time to organize, particularly if you have strong deep layer wind shear, or if you have strong storm relative inflow like we talked about. you need a lot of those auxiliary cells on the rear flank of the storm for tornadogenesis to occur, and that may take quite a while. So in most cases, you don't have to rush to get on a storm if you see it going up, but when you want to pounce quickly onto a storm is when that storm is anchored to a boundary and or there's strong low-level instability and vorticity overlapping where that storm is occurring.
Remember to check out those links in the description below, and then watch another video.